Hello anybody, Mark Johnson with news from the front. In this video I want to talk about this idea that's been floating around about globalism, the deep state, and various sort of quasi-conspiracy ideas. Theories, when we talk about conspiracies, we talk about a conspiracy theory, and people sometimes say, well, I'm a conspiracy analyst, or they talk about this, in terms of other things that come up, whether it's the JFK assassination or UFOs or whatever it may be. But just in general, a theory is not in itself bad. In fact, we have lots of good, useful theories in science and in various realms of knowledge, and these theories are backed up by certain observations. We can't, for example, directly observe the behavior of some subatomic particles. There's many things about astronomical knowledge that we can't directly back up with, first-hand observation. It's more indirect or kinds of things that we deduce from evidence and so on. So when we talk about the deep state, we talk about globalism, we're really talking about what observations can we make that might shed some light on this. And I think that one of the things that has come up, it's been floating around for some time, is a document called Silent Weapons for Silent Wars. And there's been other things similar to this. And I'm not endorsing this document as authentic. It claims to be authentic. It may or may not be, what it purportedly claims to be. But nonetheless, I think it's worth looking at this because it provides a framework for how we might think about what mechanisms of control are actually in place, and what kinds of theories that might we use to explain what we observe in our own from our own perspective. When we talk about, and I just want to go back for a second and talk about this idea that has been floating around for some time. It's not new. I haven't done any research to find out how far back it goes, but I will give a hat tip to Dr. Anthony Napoleon. He came out with a book 2 or 3 years ago now called Shadow Men, an Encyclopedia of Mind Control. And he provides a really well-researched, in this book, a very well-documented account of really the things that we can observe that have happened over the past, at least the past 100 years, probably a bit more, but even throughout human history, as to how societies are governed and controlled. This has always been the way of human society. There's going to be control mechanisms in some form or another. Throughout most of history, it was based on fear. It was based on the strong man who has the power to punish anybody who opposes him. He sets himself up as, sometimes it's through the power of some religious idea or just through brute force. And, most of the power that these people would wield was through intimidation, or through, sort of people surrendering their rights to this leader or to this, maybe a government of some kind or whatever. So you've had this kind of idea out there for really as long as people have existed. So having said that, I will talk about this document, Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, in some detail, because I think it's a particularly well articulated view about what may be happening. I think that, we look at this as sort of an architecture. Whoever did this, whether it's authentic or not, is sharp enough to come up with a way to structure the ideas and correlate them with what we actually observe. And so it makes it an interesting kind of thing to analyze. The question is, how is it possible for people to plan out and have these kinds of conspiracies where they can leverage these kinds of controls? And I think one thing we need to remember, and Stefan Molyneux talks about this a lot, and I think it's true, we have to consider the bell curve of human intelligence. And we're going to see that there are people that are, definitely, on one side of that spectrum or the other. Most of us fall in the middle somewhere. And then you have these, people that are smart enough and more, we have doctors and engineers and scientists and things like this that are going to be in the IQ levels of 130, 40, 50, and above even. And so, is it possible that these ideas can be engineered and articulated and studied and fleshed out in a way that actually works, especially given the power of computers and the other instruments that we have today of information? I certainly think it is. And I think the question becomes not so much do these kinds of quasi, if you want to call them conspiracies, but I just call them exercising control. It's not whether these things exist, it's really why should they not exist? It's just that we live now in a period since the, it's really begun back with the monetary controls and currency controls that have really taken the ascendancy in the past 200 years. You had the Andrew Jackson in 1829 to 1837, the president, who was vehemently opposed to a national bank. And I haven't read all of the different arguments that Jackson made against a national bank, but I certainly think he understood that if you control the money, you control the population. And so this decoupling of actual value from currency is a way to manipulate whole societies. And this is something we'll look at in this document. The other thing is that we saw Billy, he defeated the national bank, and so we really didn't see this until 1913 when the Federal Reserve was created. And from that time, from the Federal Reserve up to the present time, I think a lot of what we see in the financial realm or in the monetary realm, both in the United States and globally, we can certainly see there's a case to be made that these things are being used and can be used to completely control or manipulate the population. There's a lot of talk about the different groups. Is the deep state? Well, the deep state is really elements of government that are sort of below the visibility of the elected leaders or the announced leaders, and they really run things. So in this case, you could say there's a deep state element in the intelligence community, there's a deep state element in the State Department, and so on in the United States. And certainly there could be these things that exist. They also have real power. Does it exist in groups like the Bilderbergs or the Trilateral Commission or other things? And my view is this is probably not where the real power exists anymore, even though this document purports to be originated from the first Bilderberg meeting in 1954. I think that most of these things, and Anthony Napoleon will make this case as well, that we're not going to know about it. So we're going to have to use our own intelligence, our ability to observe and to analyze things and draw our own conclusions. It seems unlikely that such a document as this would come out and then be allowed to spread. But at the same time, it's a good tool to use. And again, I'm not saying whether it's authentic or not, but I'm saying it's something that we should be a little bit skeptical about in terms of its actual provenance. So I'll start out with this, and we'll look at the first document here, and I'll kind of read some of this. And it says, this document represents the doctrine adopted by the Policy Committee of the Bilderberg Group during its first known meeting in 1954. The following document, dated in May 1979, was found on July 7th, 1986, in an IBM copier that had been purchased at a surplus sale. Okay, so that's what it claims. You can actually Google this and find this document. It's a PDF. You can print it or you can just read it, and it has about 42 pages, and it has some illustrations and some things. What it attempts to do is to show that through tying the science of electronics and energy science and so on, physics and so on, you can use those models to sort of engineer economies and to even engineer societies. So things like power and resistance and, you know, different kinds of things that apply to energy can be, and electronics can be applied to economies and to economic situations. And so what they've tried to do is create a science out of this so that it can be implemented in a sort of formulaic way, and it could use certain inputs and create certain analysis that comes out of it. So the document goes on to say the following document is taken from two sources. The first was acquired on a website, listing as its source the book titled "Behold a Pale Horse" by William Cooper. The second source is a crudely copied booklet which does not contain a copyright notice or a publisher's name. So essentially it looks like they took this, they found some document. This is the, like I say, what's claimed here. I think most of the text of this document is claimed to have been from one source, and then there were some illustrations which were sort of engineering documents that were trying to use the schema of electronics, and then they were kind of tied together. So go on to the next page here, and I'll just sort of focus on the underlined sections. It says, regarding the training manual, you may have detected that we had to block out the marginal notes made by the selectee of the CIA Training Center. So apparently this is a training, this part of this is a training document for CIA people, and so it was you know, said that part of it was blocked out because of that. And it's introducing the selectee, again a CIA trainee to the conspiracy. Further down it says here, we believe that the entire world should know about this plan, so we distributed it internationally, 100 of these manuscripts, to ask individuals at top-level positions their opinions. The consensus opinion was to distribute this to as many people as who wanted it, to the end that they would not only understand the war, that war had been declared against them, but would be able to properly identify the true enemy to humanity. So I think, I'm not really sure about this, you know, what this claim is, if it's strictly from a CIA document or if it was something that was also from the Bilderbergs, but in any case, it's possible that some of this would, of course, been constructed secondarily. Maybe it wasn't originally from the Bilderberg group exactly. I don't know. It's a little bit ambiguous in my mind, at least. Silent Weapons for Quiet Wars, an Introduction to Programming, was uncovered by accident on July 7th, 1986. So I talked about that when an employee of the Boeing Aircraft Company purchased a surplus IBM copier. Okay, so here's the document as it begins. And it says, this publication marks the 25th anniversary of the Third World War, called the Quiet War, being conducted using subjective biological warfare fought with silent weapons. Further down, it talks about this manual is in itself an analog declaration of intent, such a writing must be secured from public scrutiny, otherwise it might be recognized as a technically formal declaration of domestic war. Furthermore, whenever any person or group of persons in a position of great power and without full knowledge and consent of the public uses such knowledge and methodologies for economic conquest, it must be understood that a state of domestic warfare exists between said person or group of persons and the public. I think this is something that Napoleon talks about as well, that the main thing that this kind of control gives the people that exercise it is the secrecy of it. You know, Kennedy talked about the secrecy, J. Edgar Hoover talked about secrecy, and I think that the power of this, if such a thing exists, and I think there's a good case to be made that these kinds of things, whether it's specifically based on this kind of document or not, or this kind of the ideas expressed in this document, most of the power comes from the secrecy. And so now we see the outing of, you know, corrupt media. You see the players that are behind the scenes, and there's people investigating and finding out what's going on between the parties and the media, or, you know, players like George Soros, or you see people actually looking at everything with a much more skeptical eye, especially on the right. It's interesting that the left doesn't really see it this way, but the people on the right are looking at all of the events, not only in the United States, but globally, and saying, you know, why is this? It doesn't really make sense. Why would Germany allow all of these refugees in? Or why would, you know, why is, for example, Britain getting out of the European Union? And so a lot of this, you look at the push for supranational kinds of governance that are not accountable to the people themselves through any direct, you know, elections or anything. So like the TPP created a, you know, Pacific Partnership that would have its own laws, its own governance, its own tribunals outside of the realm of the United States or any kind of, you know, legal jurisdiction we have. You also had the European Union, of course, where you would have a supranational organization creating laws, creating regulations that were outside accountability of the people that lived in those countries. And the United Nations is yet another one of these. And then you have all of the groups under the United Nations attempting at least to exercise power over peoples worldwide and themselves being unelected. So some of this is certainly consistent with what we've seen. The other thing in this document, and I think is true, and Napoleon makes the point as well, regardless of whether these strategies, these schemes are effective or not, the whole attitude of these elites, and you're talking about people that are extremely powerful, extremely wealthy. Most of this isn't necessarily even for the purpose of making money. I mean, these are people that have billions and billions and billions of dollars, and they have all of the power and money that they need to develop these ideas and implement them. They can hire people, scientists, you know, genius quality people out of the educational establishment, wherever they want. They can get any resource they need to create these strategies or to implement these strategies. So here we look at, you know, the attitude they have towards society, and there's certainly not there's a case to be made. I think a lot of us see the sort of ignorance and passivity and some of the lack of acumen that our fellow citizens have, for example. They don't seem to care what's going on, or they don't seem to understand. They don't base their opinions on facts. They don't really go to the trouble of really being engaged with either the political process or their community or the world at large. And I think that's has fostered kind of an attitude by these elites that the people are just like herd animals, beasts of burden. They can be used in any way that they want. They're not responsible. They have basically, by their behavior, by their ignorance and stupidity, given their consent for the elites to exercise this kind of control. I don't agree with that. I think that's something that moral leadership should attempt to educate and lead the population and help keep them informed and motivate them and set an example. But this, nonetheless, it's a twisted sort of perversion of what leadership should be, in my opinion. But this is the way that these people look at the average person out here in the hinterlands. It says here, you've been qualified for this project because of your ability to look at human society with cold objectivity, and yet analyze and discuss your observations and conclusions with others of similar intellectual capacity, without the loss of discretion or humility. Such virtues are exercised in your own best interest. Do not deviate from them. It says silent weapon technology has evolved from operations research, a strategic and tactical methodology developed under the military management in England. During World War II, the original purpose of operations research was to study the strategic and tactical problems of air and land defense with the objective of effective use of limited military resources against foreign enemies. Well, certainly we can see how the CIA and how other intelligence communities have to use, I would guess you could call it operations research, or there are other names perhaps for it, in order to manipulate, subvert, control the beliefs, the attitudes, whatever it may be, of people. You're using this kind of soft power against, or quiet power against, a mass of people or a nation or a group that outnumbers you, that has more resources than you do. So you have to use sort of an asynchronous attack, an attack that is secretive and yet effective in terms of what it does, how it affects minds and attitudes. It was soon recognized by those in positions of power that the same methods might be useful for totally controlling a society, but better tools were necessary. Social engineering, the analysis and automation of a society, requires the correlation of great amounts of constantly changing economic information. So a high-speed computerized data processing system was necessary, which could race ahead of society and predict when society would arrive for capitulation. And then it lists these three things. It says relay computers were too slow, but the electronic computer invented in 1946 filled the bill. The next breakthrough was the development of the simplex method of linear programming in 1947 by the mathematician George Dantzig. And the third one in 1948, the transistor, invented by Bardeen and Shockley, promised great expansion of the computer field by reducing space and power requirements. I'm a little skeptical whether it could have been foreseen at that time, but yet it's still possible that if you looked forward, you could see how these developments could enable the kinds of capabilities that we might have today. A lot of us are aware of the extreme intrusion on our privacy through, massive collection of data, whether it's telephone calls, whether it's information of all kinds going through the internet or going through our phones or our personal computers. And so certainly, whether they could foresee this at the time, the power to collect information and raw data is massive indeed. And so this is something that we will look at in a moment as to how this data can be used. With these three inventions under their direction, those in positions of power strongly suspected that it was possible for them to control the whole world with a push of a button. Immediately, the Rockefeller Foundation got in on the ground floor by making a 4-year grant to Harvard College, funding the Harvard Economic Research Project for the study of the structure of the American economy. 1 year later, in 1949, the United States Air Force joined in. I think this could probably be verified one way or the other. I don't know if it's true. It could very well be true that there was something like this done. Again, you have the Rockefeller Foundation, ostensibly one of these people that would be in this globalist kind of category. And so they're looking at, like I say, making this scientific and creating an analog or a programming kind of approach to how you do things, and they're going to use the models of engineering and apply it to economics. I think a lot of this was not understood maybe in 1913 when the Federal Reserve was set up, even though there was certainly an intuitive knowledge by people that understood currency and the way that currency operates, and the way that you could expand or contract currency, the money supplies and things like this to control society. So certainly there was some knowledge of these things, and those things were being done. But as information became much more information-centric world, and this became more, it could be done scientifically and so on. And also economic realities are very comparable to social realities. So, when you work and you make a living, you accumulate wealth in one form, or you create wealth and then you accumulate wealth by purchasing things and having private property and so on. And so when a lot of your wealth is tied up in sort of fiat currency, or in a dollar rather than, say, the actual what it's based on, such as gold, for example, you can see how the inflation and how the manipulation of currency and actually the way governments can spend money beyond what they have, all these things can be done in a way that is not readily comprehensible to people. I think there's certainly a lot of people that don't really understand how the Federal Reserve operates. They don't understand this, whatever the term is for it, this quantitative easing is just another term for creating, more money in the system, or at least more availability of money, whether it's actually pulled out of the Federal Reserve and put into the money supply, I don't know. But I think a lot of this is manipulation of the money supply and of the currency in such a way that they can control things, but very few people quite comprehend how it works, and how this interrelates with the stock market and the general prices of things and the economy overall. It's really beyond what most people can comprehend, and this works in their favor. And certainly I think if you look at the way that they implement these ideas in this document, it's the complexity of it that makes it hard for people to comprehend or even believe that it exists. It just seems almost unfeasible that people would actually sit down and create these kinds of strategies. In the next part of this, it sort of begins this analog or comparison between the physical sciences or electronic sciences and economies. It says energy is recognized as the key to all activity on Earth. Natural science is the study of the sources of and control of natural energy, and social science, theoretically expressed as economics, is the study of sources and control of social energy. So again, we're talking about the way people behave and the different kinds of inputs and outputs that happen in society through behaviors and through the measurement of behaviors through the different data that come in. It says both are bookkeeping systems, mathematics. Therefore, mathematics is the primary energy science, and the bookkeeper can be king if the public can be kept ignorant of the methodology of the bookkeeping. In 1954, this was the issue of primary concern. Although the so-called moral issues were raised in view of the law of natural selection, Darwinism, it was agreed that a nation or world of people who will not use their intelligence are no better than animals who do not have intelligence. Such people are beasts of burden and stakes on the table by choice and consent. Consequently, in the interest of future world order, peace, and tranquility, it was decided to privately wage a quiet war against the American public with an ultimate objective of permanently shifting the natural and social energy, wealth, of the undisciplined and irresponsible many into the hands of the self-disciplined and responsible and worthy few. In order to implement this objective, it was necessary to create, secure, and apply new weapons. As it turned out, were a class of weapons so subtle and sophisticated in their principle of operation and public appearance as to earn for them the name silent weapons. Okay. In conclusion, the objective of economic research as conducted by the magnates of capital, banking, and industries and commodities, goods, and services is the establishment of an economy which is totally predictable and manipulatable. And this is something maybe I've just intuited this from various things I've read and some of my own thinking, but I think certainly the motivation of the people that are in power, all of the things we see in the media, the reports, the controversies, the warnings, the things that are considered important or that are put up in front of us as important, none of this really matters as long as the people that are sort of keepers of the public, direction, as long as they can predict and manipulate what's going on, they don't really care what we think. They don't really care what we do. They're looking at behavior in the aggregate, and they're looking at how people can be shifted in one way or another. The individual doesn't really matter. What matters is what can you do in a sort of scientific and statistically valid way to move large groups of people into certain beliefs or into certain behaviors. And this is, I think, what's going on mostly. That's why the news is almost, especially the mainstream news, but even a lot of the alternative news is pretty much junk. There's really not a lot of substance behind it. Even though we hear about things like globalism and we hear about the deep state and whatever, We never get a lot of facts about it, and we never get a lot of the deeper kinds of thought behind why these things are, legitimately claimed. It says, in order to achieve a totally predictable economy, the low-class elements of society must be brought under total control, must be housebroken, trained, and assigned a yoke and long-term social duties from an early age before they have an opportunity to question the propriety of the matter. In order to achieve such conformity, the lower-class family unit must be disintegrated by a process of increasing preoccupation of the parents and the establishment of government-operated daycare centers for the occupationally orphaned children. The quality of education given to the lower class must be of the poorest sort, so that the mote of ignorance isolating the inferior class from the superior class is and remains incomprehensible to the inferior class. This form of slavery is essential to maintain some measure of social order, peace, and tranquility for the ruling upper class. It says everything that is expected from an ordinary weapon is expected from silent weapon by its creators, but only in its own manner of functioning. A little further down, it makes no obvious explosive noises, causes no obvious physical or mental injuries, and does not obviously interfere with anyone's daily social life. Even though it may not make obvious effects, it has effects that people may not know what to attribute these effects to, and which it makes the case here. It says, yet it makes an unmistakable noise, causes unmistakable physical and mental damage, and unmistakably interferes with the daily social life, i.e. unmistakable to a trained observer, one who knows what to look for. The public cannot comprehend this weapon and therefore cannot believe that they are being attacked and subdued by a weapon. The public might instinctively feel that something is wrong, and that is because the technical nature of the silent weapon, they cannot express their feelings in a rational way or handle the problem with intelligence. Therefore, they do not know how to cry for help and do not know how to associate with others to defend themselves against it. And I'm just speaking from personal, my life trajectory, what I've experienced in the last 40 years. I think we have been through a period when these kinds of tools, whether it's specifically based on this document or something like it, I've sensed for quite some time that the mind control that Napoleon talks about, the way that the media has been dominated by and controlled by a select few of people, and just generally the way economies and the way decisions get made, it did seem to me that the average person and the populace in general did not have a real say in what was going on. So to me it seems true, and I think what we are seeing now is resistance to this, and people are waking up. I don't know where this is going to lead. I don't know if we'll be successful, but I think my view was back about a year and a half ago was that we had crossed a point, something happened, and I think we had just reached a point, and I don't want to attribute all this to Donald Trump, but I think he basically exploded the idea of political correctness. I mean, he went out there and he starts talking about, the immigration issue, and he starts using, language and terms, and really most everything he did during the primary campaign there was so much of it that was outrageous, it seemed like at the time, and it was, but it was a way of, even whether it was unwitting or not, it shook people out of their stupor, and it said we have to start thinking for ourselves, whether we agree or don't agree, or whether this is politically correct or not politically correct. What is it that's really going on here? And for that, I suspect we may be eternally grateful that Trump came along to at least explode a lot of this mind control, this stupor that people were in. I can't think of a better word, but and I think for that he has done us a great service. It says here, when a silent weapon is applied gradually, the public adjusts, adapts to its presence, and learns to tolerate its encroachment on their lives until the pressure, psychological via economic, becomes too great that they crack up. Therefore, the silent weapon is a type of biological warfare. It attacks the vitality, the options, and mobility of the individuals of a society by knowing, understanding, manipulating, and attacking their sources of natural and social energy and their physical, mental, and emotional strengths and weaknesses. Seems, like I say, common sense. Somebody could have made this all up, but it certainly makes sense. Theoretical introduction. This was by Meyer Rothschild in 1743, 1812. I guess that was his lifespan. He was well known, and Napoleon talks about this too, the Rothschilds and their immense power over the economy of Britain. He says, "Give me control over a nation's currency, and I care not who makes its laws." And I think this is a core truth that people don't want to admit it, or they don't want to. I think one of the things is that people don't like to admit when they've been duped or been conned. And so I think there's a certain amount of this going on, and even today, even under the new administration, this aspect of things, whether it has to do with the national debt, whether it has to do with the economy in general, spending, taxes, but certainly the debt is not being addressed, and certainly there may be issues with addressing the debt. I mean, we've got somewhere in the neighborhood of $200 trillion in unfunded liabilities, $20 trillion in operating debt. There's no good way to get out of that debt, and yet if we get to a point, we may reach a tipping point, if we haven't already passed it, where we can't really ever pay down that debt without creating some kind of massive devaluation of our currency, inflation, or something. Okay, so it says here today's silent weapons technology is an outgrowth of a simple idea discovered, succinctly expressed, and effectively applied by Rothschild. Rothschild discovered the missing passive component of economic theory known as economic inductance. He, of course, did not think of his discovery in these 20th century terms, and to be sure, mathematical analysis had to wait for the Second Industrial Revolution. I'm assuming they mean the Information Revolution. The rise of the theory of mechanics and electronics, and finally the invention of the electronic computer before it could be effectively applied in the control of the world economy. And then the document goes on, and I'm not going to have the time to go through this entire document, but I encourage you to do so. It talks about, for example, it talks about creating, they want to analyze, and you can kind of imagine having a large staff of, statistical analysts, economic analysts, and so on. And if you're in a position where you can create some kind of a dislocation, you can create a momentary change in the supply of gasoline or beef or some other commodity. And then they can take all of this economic data, these metrics that come in, and so they create these sort of shockwave analysis. They did this on planes. They would create these, they would look at these things with, when you fire guns from a plane, what kind of vibration was created, how much could the plane sustain, where was the resonance, and so on. And so a lot of what we see, we see events, we see, sort of news coming out of the stock market, coming out about certain companies. We may see things like advertisements. Well, they look at this, and let's say there's a momentary or a temporary change in the supply of gasoline. Then they can look at the behavior throughout the economy. What do people do when there's a shortage of gasoline? And not just do they drive less, but what other things do they do? Do they save more money? What do they spend their money on in place of that? And that can have to do with almost any part of the economy. So if you have enough people, if you have enough of a staff and an organizational construct where you can analyze all of these inputs and outputs, you can basically break down and structure the whole economy in terms of how it behaves under certain conditions, what people do under certain conditions, and this applies also to the mental state of people and so on. So there's a lot of this is like I say, it's in the document. It describes the methodology in general terms, but you can certainly see how it would be applied in a much more detailed and broken down and scientific way. I'm just going to skip ahead here. Talks about, it uses the electronic, you've got inductance and capacitance and so on, and then uses that to, how do you apply that in various formulas and how it affects economies and societies. And then it goes and has some industrial diagrams and so on. And then this is the section on page 25, economic shock testing. It says in the shock testing of an aircraft airframe, the recoil impulse of a firing gun mounted on the airplane causes shock waves that in that structure, which tell the aviation engineers the conditions under which some parts of the airplane or the whole airplane or its wings will start to vibrate or flutter like a guitar string, a flute reed, or a tuning fork, and disintegrate or fall apart in flight. Economic engineers achieve the same result in studying the behavior of the economy and consumer public by carefully selecting a staple commodity such as beef, coffee, gasoline, or sugar, and causing a sudden change or a shock in its price or availability, thus kicking everybody's budget and buying habits out of shape. They then observe the shock waves which result by monitoring the changes in advertising, prices, sales, and that of other commodities. The objective of such studies is to acquire the know-how to set the public economy into a predictable state of motion or change, even a controlled, self-destructive state of motion, which will convince the public that certain expert people should take control of the money system and reestablish security, rather than liberty and justice. It goes on down in the next paragraph. Not only the prices of commodities, but also the availability of labor can be used as the means of shock testing. Labor strikes deliver excellent test shocks to an economy, especially in the critical service areas of trucking, transportation, communication, public utilities, energy, water, garbage, and so on. By shock testing, it's found that there is a direct relationship between the availability of money flowing in an economy and the real psychological outlook and response of masses of people dependent upon that availability. For example, there is a measurable quantitative relationship between the price of gasoline and the probability that a person would experience a headache, feel a need to watch a violent movie, smoke a cigarette, or go to a tavern for a mug of beer. It's most interesting that by observing and measuring the economic models by which the public tries to run from their problems and escape from reality, and by applying the mathematical theory of operations research, it's possible to program computers to predict the most probable combination of created events, shocks, which will bring about the complete control and subjugation of the public through a subversion of the public economy by shaking the plum tree. And so I think this is certainly plausible, and I think you could certainly see how if you could create the people in positions of great power could create these sort of short-term, not necessarily terribly destructive economic shocks of one kind or another. It could be a news event, it could be some rumors about a certain company, and you could create these kind of shock waves. And of course these are all being analyzed, and they're looking at the ripple effects, and they're looking for consistency, and they're looking for repeatability. And by the way, they may even use it to make money. I mean, the people that can see that there's going to be a sequence of sort of shock tests put into play, maybe they put in some shorts on the market, or they buy certain stocks or funds. Not their primary mission isn't necessarily the accumulation of wealth. They already have a lot of money, but they use it when when it's convenient. But the more effective thing, or the most important thing, is the ability to control, to predict, and guide the behavior of large groups of people. In fact, maybe even the whole world. It talks about economic amplifiers. Again, it breaks this down into great detail, not in this document, but you can see how you would look at all the possible economic amplifiers. They list off some of them here. There's certain inputs, there's sources of information, there's standard of living, various input signals, and they've got various places where information can be collected. Certainly the IRS is a great source of information, but you've got the credit bureaus, you've got all the banking system, you've got a huge amount of information that tells you about transportation of goods and where those goods are flowing, and all of this information is out there. And certainly if you're in the position of power that these people have, that information can be collected. Goes on, national input information, all the different controls. This was kind of interesting. It says table of strategies. So it says do this on the left to get this result on the right. So keep the public ignorant, you get less public organization. Maintain access to control point for feedback, required reaction to outputs, prices, and sales. Create preoccupation, you lower defense. Attack the family unit, control the education of the young. Meaning if you split families up, you force people to send their children into daycare or other things like this, then it's basically controlling the education of the young, which they are already doing through government schools and so on. Give less cash and more credit and doles, more self-indulgence, and more data. So you get more data the more people do these things. Attack the privacy of the church, destroy faith in this sort of government. Again, the American creed and the morals and ethics of the American society. Social conformity, computer programming simplicity, so they want to make everything simpler so there's fewer variables. And minimize the tax protest, maximize economic data, minimum enforcement problems. So again, these are just examples of what the kinds of analysis that could be applied, and you could have, like I say, many areas of specialty where these things were broken down and they could all be consolidated under one rubric and so on. So I'm not going to go through the rest of it, but I think it's worth looking at, and I think the control mechanisms of the economy and the currency are the prime driver of a lot of these things. So when you look at whether it's media, it's various forms of entertainment, when you look at what's going on in government, the people that fund the campaigns of certain people, you look at the behavior of certain government officials, and certainly it seems more understandable that there's an element of influence, corruption, whatever you want to call it, that is consistent in terms of this kind of a model where you're trying to control and make the mass of society predictable and manipulatable, and there we are. So it's not to say that we don't want a sort of a semi-predictable society, but at the same time just being treated as a means to a certain end, and treating people as chattel is something that none of us want, and it can lead to something much worse than what we may even have now. So that's it for now. Thank you.